Good morning, and welcome to another Seize the Day. Today is Monday, January 22nd, and as you can see, I'm still not home. Took advantage of a little special that they had for midweek getaway, so uh, trying to help my wife get a little sun before she gets back to work here. Just recovering from her, recent operation. Actually, back in that Monday after Thanksgiving. So it's been a little bit of a long haul for her, and but she's getting better. She's getting better, little by little. But appreciate you guys being here this morning. Sun rises a little uh, later for us here on all the way on the Pacific Northwest, and so we're a couple about an hour and a half away from sunrise here this morning. But we are in the midst of a study, and we have been looking at a topic called This is Life. And in this study of This is Life, we have looked at passages from Luke chapter 12, where Jesus gave us two really good insights about the way in which we look at life and what it is that we're chasing after. One of those things, right, was when he said, a man's life does not consist in the abundance of his possessions, and that we ought to be rich in the things towards God, because life is short. There is no guarantees that the things that you are accumulating for yourselves, they're not going to inherit the kingdom of heaven. Jesus would say in other places, he says that flesh and blood does not inherit the kingdom, right? So therefore, what we're finding in this whole orientation is one in which we're making sure that our hearts are right before him as we look forward to this day that is coming. The second thing that we also learned was that when Jesus talked about seeking first the kingdom of heaven, that worry was not a good alternative. Like you could have much and rely on that, or you could worry about what you have and it robs you of life. When all the time he says, look at the birds of the air, the flowers of the field, your heavenly Father takes care of them, doesn't he? He feeds them. Why would he not do the same for you? And so consequently, you begin to recognize, oh, I get it. Like if I'm going to point to something and say, this is life, then it has to bear this stamp that it's going to be mindful of this present life as well as this life that is to come. So that's what I want to talk to you about today in this passage that's found in Luke chapter 16. Very, very interesting passage, and one that is often misunderstood. But I think it'll be a lot of fun for you and I to look at this passage together. So why don't we do that? Why don't you turn with me to Luke chapter 16, and we're going to look at the story of the parable of the shrewd manager. So I'm going to just read the first couple of verses here. It says, Jesus told his disciples, there was a rich man whose manager was accused of wasting his possessions. So he called him in and he asked him, what is this I hear about you? Give an account of your management, because you cannot be manager any longer. The manager said to himself, what should I do now? My master is taking away my job. I'm not strong enough to dig, and I'm ashamed to beg. I know what I'll do, so that when I lose my job here, people will welcome me into their houses. So he called in each one of his master's debtors. He asked the first, how much do you owe my master? 800 gallons of olive oil, he replied. The manager told him, take your bill, sit down quickly, and make it 400. And then he asked the second, how much do you owe? 1,000 bushels of wheat, he replied. And he told him, well, take your bill and make it 800. The master commended that the dishonest manager because he had acted shrewdly. For the people of this world are more shrewd in dealing with their own kind than are the people of the light. I tell you, use worldly wealth to gain friends for yourselves, so that when it is gone, you will be welcomed into eternal dwellings. Whoever can be trusted with very little can also be trusted with much. And whoever is dishonest with very little will also be dishonest with much. So if you have not been trustworthy in handling worldly wealth, who will trust you with true riches? And if you have not been trustworthy with someone else's property, who will give you property of your own? No servant can serve two masters. Either he will hate the one and love the other, or he will be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve both God and mammon, or money. You know, we're always looking for direction in this life. And sometimes it may prove difficult to get the direction we really need. And one of that area that is proven difficult to navigate is often the subject of money, right? And how it becomes such a dominant pursuit of one's life. And so I think we could all benefit from some well grounded principles on which to manage one's assets. And I think the parable that we have before us can help us to do that. But the challenge is not to just understand, but to follow through, right? Because once God gives us counsel, it's not enough to hear this word. We have to put it into practice. It's also not enough to make a plan that we never execute on. It says that plans don't work because we fail to work the plan. Well, let's be frank. When it comes to this idea of managing, our assets, right? It's difficult to sometimes assume that kind of responsibility for our actions, to look in the mirror and make all the necessary changes. But when Jesus said, where your treasure is, there your heart will be also, that ought to be a real wake-up call for all of us to begin to take that inward look and begin to recognize, how are we really describing this is life? What are we really pointing to as the good life? And if it doesn't include this whole relationship that we have with him, then somehow or another, this life is deficient. And this parable is going to give us some really good insight. I know it seems a little bit confusing at times, but we'll work through it together this morning. So let's go back now and look look at this as we unpack it for us. I want you to notice that, first of all, there's this crisis, right? There's this particular manager. He's developed a poor reputation, and now he's been exposed. Look what it says in verse 1 and 2. It says, there was a rich man, right, whose manager was accused of wasting his possessions. So it's not the rich man, it's his manager that has been wasting his possessions. And so what does the rich man do? He calls him in. He wants him to give an account. Hey, what's this I hear about you? I want you to give an account of your management, because you're not going to be my manager any longer. Well, that confrontation now, exposes this manager who has been wasting the possessions of his employer, right? Well, look at verse 3 and 4. The manager says to himself, what shall I do now? My master is taking away my job, and I'm not strong enough to dig, and I'm ashamed to beg. I know what I'll do, so that when I lose my job here, people will welcome me into their houses. So what does he do? He finds himself in a crisis, and in the midst of this crisis, he develops a plan. He comes up with a strategy, because he needed to find a way to enhance his position. He was going to lose his job. So how am I going to take care of my needs? He says it himself. Look, I'm not strong enough to dig, and I'm too proud to beg. And so what am I going to do to ingratiate myself with others so that I'm not going to be in want? That's his strategy, right? Just to enhance his own position. Well, now look in Luke chapter 16. He says, so he called in each one of his master's debtors. And he asked the first, how much does my master owe? How much do you owe my master? And so one says 800 gallons of olive oil. And so he writes down, he says, all right, let's change that to 400. And then the other guy comes in and says, I owe about 1,000 bushels of wheat. And he says, all right, take down your bill, make it 800. And so you see what this manager now, he's becoming pretty shrewd, isn't he? This is all about a way now of, like I said, enhancing his position, putting himself in a good way with the debtors, who are, what are we talking about here? Oil, right? Wheat. So we're talking about staples of life here. And so if he's going to ingratiate himself with these people, then chances are you lessen my bill, I'll take care of you, right? So all of this, though, he begins to execute on this plan. And then the master finds out about it. So the rich man comes and he commends. Look what it says in verse 8. It says, the master commended the dishonest manager because he had acted shrewdly. For the people of this world are more shrewd in dealing with their own kind than are the people of the light. Isn't that interesting? The people of this world are more shrewd in dealing with their own kind than are the people of the light. So now here is where you gotta lean in a little bit and understand a little bit more about what's going on in this parable. Because Jesus just served us up a twist at the end of the story, didn't he? Because it appears that the dishonest manager is being commended. Wouldn't you think it would be the other way around, that he would not be commended? But for purposes of the story, Jesus says the dishonest manager is actually commended. However, you must note that Jesus describes the manager as dishonest, placing him squarely within the category of the people of this world as opposed to the people of the light. Let me say this again. Look at verse 8, and it says, the master commended the dishonest manager because he had acted shrewdly. For the people of this world, right? So that's one category of person, are more shrewd in dealing with their own kind than are the people of the light. And what's their own kind? It's the resources of this world, right? Because he was talking about oil, he was talking about wheat, right? So he was talking about the these staples of life. So he says, so when it comes to dealing with this world's goods, right? The people of this world are pretty shrewd in dealing with them, more so than the people of the light, which are another category of people. So it's important that you understand that right now, even though the dishonest manager is being commended, Jesus still in this story is placing him squarely in the category of the people of this world as opposed to the people of the light. Jesus commends the method, not the solution. For instance, this manager had a problem and he sought out a solution. He was looking out for his best interests. The manager was acting in a way to ensure a favorable life, right? So his life would be better. He wouldn't have to beg. He wouldn't have to, engage in hard labor. He had shown himself to be a dishonest manager and was about to lose, and was losing his job. And so he concocted this plan also that he would ensure himself a favorable life. So this is an argument that you're seeing. He's in a bad position and he's trying to make himself, a little better off. So here is the question Jesus is really posing, because he tells this story so that he would be asking if the disciples were living and acting in a way that would ensure a favorable life in God's economy, right? Are the people of the light being shrewd with their own kind? In other words, with these principles of the kingdom of heaven that God has given us, are we demonstrating a shrewdness? Are we seeking to make life better for ourselves? People of the world, this manager is saying, look, man, he's shucking and jiving, man. He's trying every which way to get a good outcome for himself. And so the reason Jesus is telling the story is because if that's how the people of the world are with their own stuff, how about the people of the light? How about those who are now claiming to walk in God's way? Are they now also being shrewd in the way in which they are living out the principles of this kingdom, because that'll determine whether or not we're living this full life. That's going to determine whether or not we could point to something and say, this is life. So what is the counsel that we're to take away from this story? Well, I think it has everything to do with managing of God's resources. All right. So get it in your head. This whole story is looking at it from how people in this world deal with the stuff of this world. And here's this guy who is trying to be shrewd the way in which he can make his life better. On the other hand, we are those who have now been given the principles of this kingdom. And God is saying to you and me, are you as shrewd in living and embracing these kingdom principles to make your life better? Because look what he goes on to say. He says, I tell you, use worldly wealth to gain friends for yourselves, so that when it is gone, you will be welcomed into eternal dwellings. See, this guy was using all this worldly wealth to gain friends for himself, right? So he would have a better life in the here and now. Jesus is saying we need to be using worldly wealth to gain friends for yourselves, so that when it is gone, you will be welcomed into eternal dwellings. Well, worldly wealth, think about that. Doesn't everything belong to God? What happens here is that the rich man was accused and exposed for the careless way he managed the rich man's resources. Why? Because everything belonged to the rich man. So to whom does the wealth belong? It didn't belong to the manager. The wealth, it belonged to the rich man. And so now Jesus is introducing this whole thought of eternity. If you and I are people of the light, then we need to be thinking about eternity. We need to be thinking about this life that is to come. Wasn't that what Jesus was saying way back in Luke chapter 12, when he talked about that man who had this bumper crop and realized that he didn't have enough barns to house all of his wealth? And he says, well, I'm going to tear down these barns, build bigger ones. And then he said he looked at all that he had stored up for himself. And he said, this is great. He goes, take life easy, eat, drink, be merry. And Jesus called him a fool. Why? Because while he was rich in worldly wealth, he wasn't rich towards God. And his life was going to be, his life was going to end. He was going to have to give an account for this life now. You ever think about that? Like how much sand is in one's hourglass? And there is going to come a day when we're going to stand before the very God who gives us life and breath. So in this parable, you begin to see there's a way that people are using worldly life to make their lives better, but not with eternity in view. They're not being rich towards God. They're not really seeking first his kingdom and his righteousness and depending on God to provide, right? Again, remember we looked at this last week. It doesn't say that we're not working hard. We have to work hard. We work in concert with the God who gives us all things. But it's never without this attitude of gratefulness, recognizing that he's given us this mind to enable us to go out and earn a living, skills, strong back. But here, Jesus adds, you have to use worldly wealth to gain friends for yourself, so that when it is gone, you'll be welcomed into eternal dwellings. Well, what's this whole idea of gaining friends? Well, see, instead of just looking out for yourself, you're trying to use your wealth to gain friends, right? He says, notice what he says here in verse 4. He says, I know what I'll do, so that when I lose my job here, people will welcome me into their houses. Right here in Luke 16:4, This isn't that what the this unjust steward says? He goes, I know what I'll do. So he was using wealth so he can gain entrance into their homes so that he could provide for himself some way. He was being shrewd. Jesus says, are you using wealth the same way so that you can enter into what? Not into their houses, but into eternal dwellings. Disciples are to use their possessions to influence people for good. For God says, when you do that kind of work, you're going to gain entrance into my kingdom. There's a passage. It's in First Corinthians. Not First Corinthians. I'll create a little banner here for you. It's found in First Timothy 6 and verses 17 through 19. All right, and I'll put this up here on the screen for you. So in 1 Corinthians 16, 17 through 19, I want you to consider this text. He says, command those who are rich in this present world not to be arrogant, nor to put their hope in wealth, which is so uncertain, but to put their hope in God, who richly provides us with everything for our enjoyment. See, that's why I tell people all the time, you don't have to feel guilty about enjoying good things. I shouldn't feel guilty because, I worked hard, I saved some money, and now I want to treat my wife to a couple of days of, some relaxation before, she has to go back to work. It's just that it says, I'm not putting my hope in these things. I'm not chasing after these things in a way that has me focused on this world where I lose sight of my responsibility to live and act in a way about this world that is to come. So to put your hope in, it says, so Paul is challenging Timothy. He's saying, listen, I want you to commend those who are rich in this present world, not to be arrogant, nor to put their hope in wealth, which is so uncertain, but to put their hope in God, who richly provides us with everything for our enjoyment. I want you to command them to do good, to be rich in good deeds, to be generous and willing to share. In this way, they will lay up treasure for themselves as a firm foundation for the coming age, so that they may take hold of the life that is truly life. Do you catch this now? Do you see when he's talking about here about the way in which we're using the wealth of this world to gain influence with other, to gain the influence of others, to do good to them, because that's way you'll be welcomed into eternal dwellings. This is exactly what Paul is saying to Timothy. Listen, don't put your hope in God, because God, he's blessing you with all of these things. But don't put your focus on the things, put your focus on the one who gives you those things. And then he says, be rich, what? In good deeds. And what do those good deeds look like? But it's someone who is generous, who's willing to share. So you're using your worldly wealth and you're trying to gain friends. See, the shrewd man, which is just doing it for himself. Jesus says there are people in the world they're really good at that, aren't they? They're really looking out. They're pretty good at looking out for number one. But who's looking out for the other guy? Who is mindful that we have a responsibility to love our neighbor as ourselves? See, that's why he says here in 1 Timothy 6, he says, God, who is rich, he richly provides us with everything for our enjoyment. So to command those to do good, to be rich in good deeds, to be generous, willing to share. In this way, you lay up treasure for yourself as a firm foundation for the coming age, so that they may take hold of the life that is truly life. See, this is what all of these lessons have been about, haven't they? It's about describing what is life. This is life. You see the skies becoming behind me now, right? New day is beginning. With this kind of perspective, it enables us to lay hold of this day, to lay hold of the life that is truly life. Yo, I kind of like this background right now. Seize the day and remember that God is good all the time. Lord willing, we'll continue this lesson again tomorrow. But rethink about this whole unjust steward parable, because it's just talking about the way people live out this life in this world. They're conniving and scheming to make it easy for themselves. Jesus says, hey, look at them. You got to commend them, man. They're pretty clever. But how clever are my disciples in the way in which they use worldly wealth to enter into eternal dwellings? See, when we're using the things of this world for God's purposes, we're in a great, great space. Because now he can trust you. Well, we'll get into the rest of this parable as Jesus unfolds it for you, but it's a good start today. Looking forward, God willing, to spending some more time again with you tomorrow. God bless.